Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with some autumn book recommendations. I realize this may seem kind of early to be talking about fall reading. Not for me. The second that it hits September 1st, it's autumn. I really love this time of year. I particularly love the cooler weather. I am just someone who is sapped by heat. I'm happy for all the summer-loving girlies out there, but thankfully my time is finally coming and it's going to get cooler and it's going to get dark earlier and I'm just going to be in my element. And so I kind of view autumn as September, October, November, even though autumn technically doesn't start until the 21st of September. I just do that because once it shifts over to December, it really feels like a winter month because of Christmas. And so I want to make sure that I have time throughout all of the autumn months to read everything that I want to read. This is going to be kind of a scattered list. I felt as though I had a list that was pretty long, that was just exclusively classics that I think are great reads for the autumn time. I also had a pretty long list of books that I think are a little bit more appropriate to read closer to Halloween. And so I just decided to save those lists and possibly I will do separate videos on them. So I've included just a couple of classics here and a couple of more atmospheric reads that you might want to read closer to Halloween, but I didn't include any horror at all, basically because I just felt like that would be a fun video to do a little bit closer to Halloween. I tried to kind of police myself here as well and just make sure that I kept it to maybe one or two things per category and per genre. And so that just made a little bit more sense to me because it does seem like the best time of year to be reading thrillers and mysteries, or to be reading fantasy, or to be reading big, thick classics like Charles Dickens. And so I basically allowed myself one or two books per genre. And so hopefully this is a nice, concise list of books that I think are great to read this time of year. One thing I will say that I really love to read at this time of year, and I know a lot of people do, are just in general dark academia books. And I have two videos on my channel that are just all dark academia recommendations. And so I will link to those up above and down below if you want to see those. I don't think I will mention any dark academia picks here. So let's go on and get into my list. The first thing that I want to recommend is in fact a classic, and is also a classic that I recommended as a dark academia pick. But I just feel as though the fall vibes are immaculate. And that is Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. And I think most people know this is in some ways a bit of a thriller. It is about a murder, but we know who committed it. And it's basically a story of guilt. And also it kind of analyzes societal pressures. But our main character is a student, a university student who is down on his luck. And so I feel like it scratches the dark academia itch as well. I really like Dostoevsky, and I think possibly the majority of his works could fit in an autumn recommendation or a winter recommendation video. But I think Crime and Punishment is very approachable. I think it is a good one to start with from him. And I think it's just very enjoyable at this time of year. It's partially a thriller, but it's also got kind of this atmospheric, very autumnal style of writing. I think this is a really good one, and I think it's a good place to start. If you have never read Dostoevsky before, I think you would really enjoy beginning your journey with him here. I also could mention literally every Anne Rice book ever here, but I wanted to pick one that I think really hits the vibes well, and it's actually not one of her Vampire Chronicles books. I do think Interview with the Vampire has a very fall vibe, and I just think the lush writing makes it very appropriate to read at this time of year. But there's also a level of kind of summer to Interview with the Vampire, in my opinion, just because it's set in New Orleans for the most part, and so it feels very sticky and humid like the summer. And so the book I would recommend of hers to read this fall is The Witching Hour. I have always said, and I still believe this is true, I think The Witching Hour is objectively her best written work. This is very, very long, and I think it will take you some time to get through, but I really enjoy in the fall reading a long, thick book. This one is also very atmospheric. The large majority of this book is exploring the history of this family of witches. And so there is this part that is really, I think, the large majority of the middle section of the book, where they kind of take you through the ages and explore each individual family member over the centuries. So there is an element of historical fiction here, which I think is really wonderful to read during the autumn. I love this. This is also basically the only book of hers that has ever scared me. Again, I say this a lot, but vampires are not terrifying to me. I'm not scared of vampires. I am attracted to them. Witches, I also don't typically feel any fear towards, but there is a character in this that really sets me on edge. And this is the only book of hers that I've ever felt like I couldn't keep reading at night. And so I think this is also a very Halloween-y book. It's just a very long one, so I struggle to recommend it to people. But if you love Anne Rice's writing, if you've read something else by her and you enjoyed her style, you will love this. In terms of a more straightforward mystery thriller type book, my favorite that I have ever read, I know this is a very basic pick, but I am nothing if not basic. This is my favorite thriller I've ever read, and it is In the Woods by Tana French. I know most people, in terms of an autumn recommendation, when talking about Tana French, would mention The Likeness, which is the second book in this series. This is the first. I agree, because I think I read The Likeness in autumn and I just think it really fits well. But in terms of a book that I really loved and that I feel confident in recommending, In the Woods has it all. So this is basically a murder mystery that is following one of the detectives on the Dublin murder squad. So it's set in Ireland, but what makes this so good for the fall is that the body is found on like an archaeological dig. And our main character is also exploring things that happened in his past. And so there's just like this element of digging through the past that occurs on every level throughout this story. It is truly brilliantly written. I think her writing style is just utterly gorgeous. That's why I enjoyed this. That's why this is my favorite thriller. I have very rarely read mystery or thriller books that had this level of prose writing. And so this is definitely my favorite, and I think it is absolutely perfect to read at this time of year. If you are a seasoned mystery and thriller reader, I think this one might not work as well for you, because I do feel as though I recall that I figured out who did it. And if you're someone who really needs that to be the large mystery of the book, you might not enjoy this. But for me, it was just such an interesting character study of our main character and how the setting was described, how he was described, how the mystery unfolded. It just was everything. I mean, it was just a perfect book in my opinion. And so this is not only my favorite thriller, it's just in general one of my favorite books that I've ever read. I did a winter recommendations video last year, and I intended to do a recommendation for every season of the year, but you see that I didn't do one for spring or summer, and now we're here in autumn. But in that video, I talked about how I really enjoy reading fairy tales in the wintertime, but I also enjoy reading them in the fall. And so in winter, my fairy tale author is definitely Hans Christian Andersen. In the autumn, it is the iconic Brothers Grimm. If you have never read the original Brothers Grimm fairy tales, oh my gosh, you're in for a treat. First of all, they are incredibly dark. They are not at all what kind of the sanitized fairy tales that we grew up on would lead you to believe. It's certainly not the Disney style. I think most of us know now that the Grimm's fairy tales are very, very dark and gothic, and they're very gory. But it's still kind of shocking to go back and read. Most of my favorites of the Grimm's fairy tales are the ones that didn't really become massively popular. But I do have to say, their Rapunzel, it's just a banger. Their version of Rapunzel is incredible to me, and it's one of my favorite fairy tales of all time. And I also love their Snow White. These are very, very dark, and I think it makes them very appropriate to autumn. And they also feel a little bit Halloween-y, actually, because of that. But I love the Grimm brothers. I actually have a favorite fairy tale author for each season of the year. So like Charles Perrault for me is very spring. Andrew Lang is very, very summer because of his illustrations. The Grimms, they are autumn personified. Another classic that I do feel crosses over into dark academia a bit, and I think I recommended it in that video, but this is my favorite book that I've read this year, and I feel like I would have loved it even more if that was possible if I had just read it in the autumn, and that is Demian by Hermann Hesse. This is another perfect book. I mean, really, I wouldn't change anything about this. This has a very charismatic and atmospheric way of writing that pulls you in. It's also a bit of a character study, so it's kind of slow. It doesn't feel as though there's much of a plot, but I think that means that it's basically running on the vibes. And I think of books that are basically vibes, no plot, as very autumnal books. This also has a real darkness and almost a gothic quality to it that makes it cross over into just a realm of like existential conversation and like what will happen to us once we die, good versus evil, how you should make decisions. This is a very deep and introspective work, and I think it feels like a book that you should be reading while you're drinking coffee in a coffee shop and the leaves are falling down outside, maybe rain's coming up. It just feels very much like a book that you should pick up in the autumn. One of my favorite books of all time is a book that I think could also go into a winter recommendations actually, but this is Deathless by Catherynne Valente, and I'm going to go on and put a disclaimer out there. This book is not for everybody. In fact, I would say it's not for 75% of readers. Like, this is a book I've seen people have a very visceral reaction to, and it's one you're either completely obsessed with or you just don't get. You completely hate it. It's very weirdly written, and that makes it a hard sell, but I think it is perfect for this time of year because it is a fairy tale retelling. It retells the Russian fairy tale of Marya Morevna and Koshi the Deathless. But it is set in World War II in Russia. It's very strange, as most Russian fairy tales are, but I think this one is a little bit more straightforward than some of the others that I've read. I truly love this book. It is one I feel like I need to reread because I wonder if it would hold up, but I really think the atmosphere here is just perfect for the fall. There's an element of historical fiction to it, there's an element of fairy tale to it, and there's also an element of horror, just a little bit to it as well. But again, I feel like this book is not for everyone, so take my recommendation with a grain of salt. So this is my most controversial recommendation. I think you will either love or hate this. A book that I am currently reading, I feel like really fits for this time of year, and that is Fire and Blood by George R.R. Martin. I know. I am reading this because the new show, House of the Dragon, is based on this, and I'm loving it. This is essentially a history book that is set in the world of Game of Thrones, and it is specifically focusing on the family called the Targaryens, who were the dragon riders, and so they have dragons. There is so much about this that is just genuinely fascinating to me. It's so much more enjoyable than a real history book because George R.R. Martin has a real gift with words, but he also draws pretty heavily from real historical events, which makes this just a fascinating read for me as somebody who's really into medieval history, because I can tell he's pulling a lot from kind of the age of Matilda and Stephen in English history. That's a lot of what this is, and that's a lot of what House of the Dragon will be adapting, in my opinion. But it also means that the book is just many-layered and many-faceted. I am really shocked that I'm enjoying this as much as I am because I didn't think I would like something that wasn't straightforward fiction from him or straightforwardly a novel. But there's something very cozy about George R.R. Martin's writing to me. In fact, the entire Game of Thrones series could go here, but I really think a history book, a nonfiction, is also something that I really crave at this time of year, and so this hits a lot of marks for me. It's a detailed fantasy book, but it's also a nonfiction. It's just a lot of things in one that I think really fit for this time of year. Another book that I'm going to recommend, I feel, is a perennial favorite for the autumn, and that is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. I think it works really great, especially for this time that we're in right now, where we're kind of switching over from summer into fall here in the Northern Hemisphere, because there's kind of like a summery or beachy vibe to this a little bit because the sea plays a pretty important role in this. My favorite thing about this book actually is that it is so short, and so it's really easy to slam out, but it's very heavy on the vibes and kind of the atmosphere, and it really sucks you in because there is also a mystery element to this story that you're trying to figure out, which I think makes it an ideal fall read. Sorry that the lighting changed. Had to turn on the light because rain is coming in, so it was getting very atmospheric and autumnal in here, but it meant it was getting really dark. And so the next book that I want to recommend is Portrait of a Thief. This came out earlier this year, and it is a book that I got an ARC of last year. I really loved this book because I think the conversations that are happening in it are very important, and they're just very interesting to me. And so this is about a group of college students who are going around to different museums in the West and stealing back Chinese artifacts to be put in museums in China. And so the conversation at large is about history and about colonialism, and it's also really discussing the importance of museums and the function of museums in certain countries and in certain societies. It also feels very stylistic because you can very easily picture the characters and you can picture what they're wearing. There's also a bit of a mystery element here, but I really appreciate the conversations that the book was trying to have. And so this one is a high recommend from me, and I think it's just a great one to read this time of year. Another of my favorite books of the year is a book that has now been nominated for the Booker. It's been longlisted for the Booker, and I am so proud. I am so proud, and I hope it wins. I know it won't, but that is Booth by Karen Joy Fowler. I think it's a long shot for this one to get onto the short list, actually, but I truly adore this, so I'm just happy to see it longlisted for the Booker. This is phenomenal writing. This is also very atmospheric, very lushly written, which I think is kind of the theme for my recommendations for fall reads this year. But this is about the Booth family. The most famous member of the Booth family, John Wilkes Booth, assassinated U.S. President Abraham Lincoln in 1865. But more broadly, the family is just a family of actors, and they are specifically Shakespearean actors. And thus, this book kind of has a level of theatricality in its descriptions that makes it so much fun to read. The book also doesn't really focus on John Wilkes or the assassination at all, which I think is one of the strong points of it, because you were certainly more interested in the rest of the family than you are in John Wilkes anyway. And a lot of my favorite elements about this, and a lot of the reason I would recommend it as a fall recommendation in particular, I can't say because I think it's pretty spoilery, but just know there are elements to this that I think make it the perfect autumnal read. I really enjoy reading historical fiction at this time of year, particularly long, kind of dense historical fiction about figures that I may know very little about, and Booth is definitely that. I was not at all familiar with the Booth family more broadly, and I think this book really shined a light on them and the time in which they were living in such a really unique way. This is possibly my second favorite book of the year after Demian by Hermann Hesse. I just truly loved this, and I think it is such an ideal autumn read. Victober is coming, and so I did have to include at least one Victorian novel. I'm telling you, I had an entire list of classics that I could recommend for autumn, and so maybe I'll just go ahead and film that video next. But I feel like I had to include the top dog here. I think there is one book that is a Victorian novel that really is the iconic autumn book to me. I feel like a lot of Victorian novels really fit this time of year, but this one is the ideal to me. And that is Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. I mean, truly, this book has it all. This book has atmosphere. It kind of has a gothic vibe, which makes it feel very Halloween-y in places. The character of Miss Havisham in particular, I feel like she alone pushes this book into autumn territory. There's a real wholesome quality about this too, where everything kind of comes together in the end. It's very heartwarming. It's very iconically Dickens in that way. But I just feel like in general, the atmosphere, the description of the city, the description of the landscape, and how the characters interact with one another make this book kind of the iconic autumn recommendation in terms of Victorian novels. There are so many I could have put here. Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights. Wuthering Heights I was really torn on, but I just think this one is the one that has it all. And I think it is also the Victorian novel with possibly the broadest appeal that I could have recommended here. I really love Charles Dickens. Not everyone does, but if you were going to try him, I think this is a great place to start. And I also think it is possibly his best work. Kind of going hand in hand with that, I really love to read this time of year kind of monster crossovers. That's one of my favorite film tropes, or things like Hotel Transylvania, the Van Helsing movie, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, where a lot of different characters from different books interact with one another. And I finally found a book series that I feel like scratches that same itch, and that is The Strange Case of the Alchemist's Daughter by Theodora Goss. And this puts a feminist twist on a lot of the stories, and it includes only female characters. And so in a lot of cases, this will be the daughter of the more famous character from a Victorian novel, like The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. There is a Jekyll and there is a Hyde, but they are both female characters, which is so interesting. This one is really entertaining because it's very funny and it's very tongue-in-cheek, and it knows its source material so well. I feel like this series in general is just very, very charming, and I really, really appreciate just how genuinely funny it was. But there's also a mystery element here in each novel. I feel like, sadly enough, this is a trilogy. I feel like each book does get progressively not worse, but I was a little bit disappointed in the second book, and then I was very disappointed in the third. But the first book is definitely the strongest, and I do feel like it could stand on its own if you don't want to carry on with the series. Last but not least, another of my favorite authors. In fact, I would almost say this author is my favorite fantasy author currently. I think a lot of this author's works could be recommended in an autumn recommendations video, but I wanted to just go with one that I think really just overall fits the vibe, and that is Dreamer's Pool by Juliet Marillier. I love Juliet Marillier. Daughter of the Forest is one of my favorite books of all time, but I have truly enjoyed the majority of what she has written. This is a series, I think it's just a trilogy actually, of 3 books that is more of a mystery series set kind of in medieval Ireland. There is a fantasy element here, as there often is in her books, that has to do with the Fae, and each book individually has its own kind of magical mystery. I think this is really fun. I think this is really cozy. I will say Juliet Marillier's books often deal with kind of darker themes and topics, so I would look up trigger warnings. There is something particularly cozy about this series of hers. Akin to The Strange Case of the Alchemist's Daughter, though, I feel as though this first book was the one I thought was the strongest of the trilogy. Again, any Juliet Marillier book could have been included here, but this is the one that really struck me today. So those were my autumn recommendations this year. This is a video that could have been an hour and a half long. Most of the books that I really enjoy reading, I feel like have an autumn or a fall vibe to them. And so this really just could have been a very, very long video. I'm glad that I decided to narrow myself down to basically 1 or 2 from each category. But these are the books that I would recommend that you read in the autumn. I would love to hear some recommendations from y'all down in the comments. But that's going to be all from me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.